Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of The Crossroads. I am your host, Rashida Green, and this is the show for and about environmental justice and those who fight the fight with skin as melanated as the days are long. Knowledge is power, and we are breaking down stereotypes one episode at a time. Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of The Crossroads. I don't know what day we're on for quarantine. Don't ask me, but all the days have officially run together. So hello, whatever day this is. So before we get the show started, I want to give some flowers. So the person that I picked today to give some flowers to is actually Dr. Gladys West. You may or may not know who she is. And if you don't, she is the Black woman who invented the GPS, or the Global Positioning System. She studied math at Virginia State University in HBCU. She also received her master's degree. She went on to work at the Naval Surface Warfare Center, Dahlgren Division. And that's where she actually collected the data from the satellites that was used for GPS. So giving flowers to her on today. So for this episode, this is going to be another case study focusing on water and how water moves around the earth, and locally some of the legislation, U.S. legislation that has been created in theory to protect it, and some of the changes that are coming about as a result of the coronavirus. So this episode is going to be a mix of science and some public policy stuff. So get some notes, get some paper, or whatever you prefer to use to take your notes with. So let's talk about the hydrological cycle, or just simply the water cycle. So the water cycle is the continuous moving of water above, on, and below the Earth's surface. Biogeochemical processes are pathways through which a chemical substance moves from living and through non-living components of the earth. So biotic or abiotic compartments of the earth. And the water cycle is considered to be one of the most vital of all of our cycles. All of them are important, and they also range from being as somewhere as short as a couple of days to millions of years. And some cycles, like the water cycle in particular, has like a storage space. So the water cycle has storage space all around the earth. So an example, or all of the water cycle reservoirs are the atmosphere, the ocean, lakes and rivers, ice and snow in the mountains, and groundwater and aquifers. I'm going to use this time to get into what exactly I mean when I say groundwater. And looking at this from an urban planning perspective, water has to be taken into account for every aspect of life, and that includes our urban centers. If you think about it, if you think about where you live, if you live in a major city, you'll notice that it is in proximity to a body of water, a river, usually. So there are 7 major steps of the water cycle, and they are evaporation, condensation, sublimation, precipitation, transpiration, runoff, and infiltration. So let's visualize. Let's think about this, right? Let's pretend that you're looking out at an ocean. It's a sunny day, and you can see the water on the ocean surface. You can see the sun warming the ocean surface. And then you get down onto the ocean surface, and you can see yourself as a droplet of water, being so energized by the sun that you rise up and turn into water vapor. That is evaporation. Now, imagine that you are standing on the top of a cold mountain. Ice that has formed on the top of this mountain, ice can be converted into water vapor and not liquid water. Meaning, if you're visualizing this, on this mountain, you are seeing ice be directly converted back into water vapor and entering the atmosphere. And that is sublimation. Up in the sky again, a storm cloud is forming. Clouds, or condensed water, empty and pour down. That right there is precipitation. When it rains, water is absorbed by the soil. Plants absorb the water and they release it as a byproduct, as water vapor, back into the atmosphere. That is transpiration. When water comes down from wherever, from mountains, from a lake, when it drains into a body of water, that is called runoff. And that's basically, again, where water runs over the Earth's surface. And last, but certainly not least in this process, water that doesn't become runoff is absorbed deep into the soil and held in aquifers underground. This is called infiltration. Eventually, the water returns back to the ocean. And that is the water cycle. That was nice. I like that. I'm gonna have to do that again. I'm gonna have to do this again. I like this. Okay. I just wanted to do something kind of cool and kind of calming. You know, I'm just trying to do whatever I possibly can to calm people's spirits. So kind of getting back to what I discussed in previous episodes, which is groundwater. And as I mentioned during the very calming and very relaxing water cycle segment, that groundwater lives beneath the Earth's surface. And I mentioned the term aquifer. So an aquifer is an underground layer of rock or rock fractures that contain water. And they can be close to the surface or, used as irrigation or used for wells. Some people have private wells on their property. And irrigation, obviously, for personal use and also for agriculture. And other aquifers could be as deeper than 30,000 feet. So all the steps that I mentioned in the water cycle are all interdependent. That means that if there's contamination at one point, it will end up in the other areas of the cycle and in other living, breathing things. In essence, if there is one point of contamination, there's multiple points of contamination that likely whatever it is will end up in our soil and in our water and in the air. So how are humans interfering with the water cycle? Because we're doing it. So one of the main ways that we contribute to messing up things is through groundwater contamination. And basically that is any kind of man-made material that ends up in the groundwater and it makes it unfit for human consumption. And some examples of some man-made materials that are not too great for the environment: gasoline, oil, road salts, and other awesome chemicals. And these materials, like road salts, for example, and fertilizer too, all end up in the soil and eventually end up in the groundwater. And a prime example, or getting a little deeper into what I mentioned about fertilizer. So thinking about fertilizers or pesticides too, but we'll stick to fertilizer in this case. What is in fertilizer that helps to make things grow is nitrogen. So nitrogen occurs naturally in the soil, and it's a separate process when fertilizer is used, which is all about bolstering crop production, it damages the soil because there's a natural balance of nitrogen already. The excess nitrogen that is not being used by any of the organisms that rely on nitrogen, that seeps down into the aquifers or seeps down into the groundwater. And that is cycled through the ocean. And you can imagine what kind of awesome things that does to the marine life. They love it. They don't love it. And it eventually will end up in the atmosphere and then rain right on back down onto us, onto our lawns. It's the water relying on for our wastewater. It's around. The drip is always around. So getting back to groundwater contamination, there's some other areas or other sources of groundwater contamination, and those are storage tanks, so that big giant things that store gasoline or oil. And there are actually estimated 10 million storage tanks buried in the U.S. that will potentially leak over time. There's also septic tanks. Ew. Uncontrolled hazardous waste. So there's 20,000 known, abandoned, and uncontrolled hazardous waste sites. I'm going to say that again. There are 20,000 known abandoned and uncontrolled hazardous waste sites in America. Landfills. I mean, that's where all your garbage ends up. So the tricky thing about landfills is that they're supposed to be lined. So in the last episode, I talked about the dry tomb and this concept of what Hooker Chemical did the first time when they bought the land was to put a clay liner over it. So that's done in theory to protect against any possible liquid that could get through the barrier and into the groundwater. So basically it is like that literal Charmin's commercial of pouring some pink liquid onto a piece of paper and watching the egg fall through. That's what it is. That's basically the only layer that's protecting our groundwater from horrifying amounts of chemicals. So, and there's a chance that these barriers, these liners, aren't there. That not every landfill has one. That means that it's just open, disgusting, all types of chemicals. And I've talked about the chemicals, and I will always talk about the chemicals. But for right now, it's all types of chemicals that are possibly contaminating our drinking water. So I did the soothing bit so that I could hit you with this. Okay, it's fine. So another chemical, or like road salts, and those are what we see when it snows, when they throw all the salt down. Where do you think that stuff ends up? And as I was mentioning about how the water cycle, like all cycles, are connected and interdependent, meaning that if there's groundwater contaminate, or if there's any kind of atmospheric contaminants, that eventually they're going to end up in the groundwater. So there was some interesting legislation that came out during the second wave of environmentalism, and I've talked about this in previous episodes too, but just, this is the era of the 1970s was also a time of a lot of environmental legislation. It was also the time period of the birthing of the environmental justice movement, which is the Black, poor, people of color movement against harmful environmental injustices that were happening at the time. So one of the legislations pertaining to water that is important is the Clean Water Act. So this was passed in 1972 and was designed to restore and maintain healthy water. So when I saw this, and I was like, restore? Not that I didn't know that it was a problem, but more of like, okay, so what were you all doing prior to that? And well, they were dumping raw sewage. Okay. That's the purpose. That was the original intent of this bill. It was amended in 1977 to regulate the discharge of untreated wastewater from cities and industrial plants. So again, the question that came up for me was, well, what were y'all doing? And if you go back and listen to my last episode, you can hear what they were doing. Next, oh, wait, no, one more thing, one more key bit to mention about the Clean Water Act. So also another important part of this bill, was that it set the minimum standards for water quality. Minimum standards. Not the best the water is supposed to be, but just enough so it doesn't kill people. All right. Next, the Safe Drinking Water Act of 1974. So this was the first federal law mandating public drinking water standards. Okay, this is 1974. It applies to every single public drinking water system in the U.S. except for private wells. Now, states are required to have a source water assessment plan and a overarching program and a plan that outlines the boundaries of areas that provide the source water to public water systems, and also identify and regulate contaminants, and maintaining a registry of regulated, and also working on identifying the unregulated contaminants too, and also letting citizens know that, hey man, there's something in the water. So why am I telling you all this? Why did I take you through a super meditative version of the water cycle and then dash your dreams talking about terrible legislation, and also like that only has the standards, the minimum standards, and then also talk to you about how we're messing it up and there's a whole bunch of storage tanks that could just leak one day? I mean, it's not fair. But why am I telling you this? So this is important because in the midst of what we're going through right now, where we're all trying to keep our sanity and keep informed about what's going on about the coronavirus, the Trump administration is having a fucking field day on environmental laws. I wish I didn't have to say a bad word, but there's the only way I can describe it. A whole on field day. Okay. He is making good on his initial campaign promise of building the wall, which makes the crazy whites very excited. And so in pursuit of that, he has basically waived a whole lot of laws, like a whole lot of acts, including the Clean Water Act. And another piece of legislation that I talked about on this show that is also something that he waived away was the NEPA, the National Environmental Protection Act. And Black Millennials for Flint were asking folks to make comments about the changes, the proposed changes that the Trump administration was making to NEPA, which would make it ineffectual. Just a completely useless bill. And not too long after that, because that was in March, so not too long after that, we're seeing this. And so I encourage you guys to go back and listen to the call to action episode where I cover that. But basically, NEPA was signed in 1970, and it required every federal agency to take an assessment of the environmental impact of any project that it plans to implement. And this was completely weakened before just being completely waved away. On April 15th of this year, 2020, the acting secretary of the Department of Homeland Security issued a notice of determination, basically saying that it cannot abide by specific environmental laws because they must build this wall. It was mandated by Congress. Trump issued an executive order. It had to be done. And that was on April 15th. So I'm bringing all this up because while we're dealing with all these things, there's a lot of changes being made legislatively that people are missing because we are so focused on COVID and what are we going to do and when are we going to go back, be able to get our lives back. I'm unemployed or I can't open my business. And yes, and it's like we have to focus on these things because they are impacting everybody. And while that's unfortunately happening, there's a lot of other things going on on the back end that we're not seeing. And so that's why I'm bringing this up. You know, we rely on water for everything, including the food that we eat. So, you know, when I'm talking to you about the water cycle, you know, take a minute and think about like what your watershed is. Like that's the area of land that drains into a body of water. So for me, that's the Potomac River, right? And, you know, another term for watershed might be basin, if you've heard that term used before, you know, and we're always using water, always, from washing your clothes, your dishes, your hair, your body, your feet, all of it. And there's opportunities just by human use for contamination. Think about when you pour grease down the drain. And yes, there's treatment. There's a wastewater treatment facility that manages that. But again, based upon what I've talked about in some of the water legislation, you can see that it's not so much about setting the highest bar. It's just about the minimum standards so you don't kill people. And there's water quality differences by state. There's some states that have really great drinking water. Actually, Baltimore City has consistently been ranked as having some of the best public drinking water. And that is, that's actually because they have done a very good job maintaining their source water. But, that's not the same for everybody, obviously. I mean, Flint, Michigan, hello. So that's why I bring this up. That's like the importance of talking about this. So when you're thinking about your watershed, thinking also about, ways in your own life that you can possibly contribute to polluting the water, but also in larger scheme of things, it's really about these corporations that are positioned right next to a river or a body of water, because you got to have water to help power the plant. Like, these things are interdependent. So when we have these man-made devices, they usually require or are powered in some way by the natural environment, but it's extractive, meaning that it's just taking things away and not replacing it. So when I said fertilizer as an example of, how nitrogen in this example seeps into the groundwater, or excess nitrogen or nitrogen byproducts enter into the water, that is what I'm talking about when I say extractive. It's doing more harm to the soil and the earth than what is necessary. And it's a harm, right? So it's not just on us as individual citizens. It's not just on our shoulders. It's a lot of these corporations too that are right now being allowed. They're like the Joker coming down the steps. Like, I never watched that movie, but that's just what I imagine. Just a bunch of like real excited industry CEOs being like, whoa, and just, okay. Getting back into the flow in terms of like wastewater. So when we're thinking about all the waste that is taken from our septic tanks and taken through the pipes and to the water treatment plant, when it's separated, when that hair, the oil, the poopy, all the old wire hangers, all the things that are separated from the water to be treated and flushed back into whatever your source water is. For me, it's the Potomac. That all ends up in the landfill. So all the poop and the hangers and old rollerblades, all that stuff ends up in the landfill. And groundwater in this particular case of the landfill is not the only opportunity for contamination. There's gases that get emitted from landfills, like methane. So methane gas is not welcomed in the atmosphere. It's not a good thing to have excess carbon in the atmosphere anyway, but methane gas in particular is unhelpful and it's harmful and contributes to climate change. So we're getting it from both ends. And so I bring this up. So, we're talking about bills in the United States that regulate water. We also have to take in consideration how this is impacting us globally. And climate change is a global problem. And although there might be a federal standard for water quality, there's a lot that are just recommendations. Speaking about U.S. legislation, a lot of them are just recommendations. And states are not required to follow them. And so who gets the short end of the stick? And there's also the matter of other organisms that rely on water other than human beings, which are like all of them. Like I mentioned that plants are a part of the water cycle because of transpiration, where they release water vapor back into the atmosphere. So in essence, not only is the water cycle necessary for our immediate needs to wash our butts and drink from it, it's also giving life to plants, giving life to animals, and contributing to biodiversity. And so when contamination is introduced, it prevents these things from becoming possible. last but not least, on a legislative tip, under the 1972 Clean Water Act came the Waters of the United States rule. It's a real thing, all about the navigable waters and what that means, which caused a whole hullabaloo. But this came out of 2015, out of the Obama administration, where the Waters of the United States rule, or just called the Clean Water Rule, put restriction on pollutants being used near streams and wetlands. And it has, among other environmental bills that I've talked about or haven't talked about, it's been repealed. I mean, it's been repealed. So this rule of like putting restrictions on pollutants covered 60% of all U.S. bodies of water. 60%. And of course, when it was introduced, no surprises, the oil and the gas and fertilizer and pesticide companies were like, no, and obviously very much so were vehemently opposed to this bill or this rule. And now that this rule and other legislation has been repealed, polluters don't need a permit to dump chemicals into the wetlands. And so, okay, you're like, all right, now, so you've said this word wetlands, like what is a wetland? So wetlands are kind of just, when you think of it, I like to think of a wetland, my favorite thing is either a swamp, or if you've ever been to, like if you've ever seen mangrove trees, like that kind of, those are like wetlands, like plants that have over time have grown, still rely on the water, and it may be in or positioned close to it, but have grown out of it. And just like the life that's now able to that is living now or can live. So fish, photosynthetic life, all these things can live in fresh water. And that is the wetlands. When you think about the wetlands, think about the swamp. That's the easiest way to think about it. But there are definitely places of opportunities for different kinds of life. And they're sensitive. It's sensitive, like the oceans are sensitive, like the coral reef that we hear about it's changing colors. The wetlands are just as sensitive. They're sensitive to acidity, changes in acidity or pH in the water. And that can result in a loss of life. And so really, the purpose of this episode isn't really to tell you to do anything. This is more educational and raising awareness, because, we don't always think about this. We don't think about water. We don't think about the laws in place to regulate it, if you can call them that. You're aware of this now, and you can ask your relatives or hell yourself if you don't know, and figure out what your watershed is, man. Like, figure out what that is. Where is your source of water? And think about where the process of getting it from your shower down the drain, or your toilet or your sink down the drain, and where it ends up. Just give it some thought. Look it up. Look at the water quality in your city or your town. How does that compare? What about from like the state level? What is the water quality of your state? And do a comparison of like other cities or countries. Hell, countries too, but like other cities and other states. Like, see what that looks like. How do you measure up? And I will always advocate for writing your congressman or your senator and saying, like, look, you need to tighten up, or whatever it is, probably tighten up. Maybe not, depending on what state you live in, if you're like in a really liberal state. But for a lot of people, you really got to ask your legislators to tighten up. And I hope this was informative. I hope you enjoyed making the sounds as much as I liked listening to them. And as I get ready to close the show with some shout outs, and announcements too. So first announcement is that I will be going live on Instagram with Seema Thomas, Professor Thomas. You might remember her. She was on the show recently. So on Thursday, the 14th of May, I will be going live with Seema at 6:00. We're going to be talking about a lot of the rollbacks that I mentioned on this episode, a lot of the rollbacks to the environmental legislation, and what's closed, and what changes or proposed legislation changes are open for comments, whatever the heck that means. And, if you're keeping up with the news, you know that Trump has already announced wanting to push the border wall, in the construction of the border wall. And that's what he's done. And he's waived a lot of environmental rules to make that happen. So join Seema and I on Thursday at 6:00 on IG Live. Shout out to Drilled News. They developed a climate COVID-19 tracker, which basically tracks all the environmental or climate change related legislation and like what's going on. And this has been something that I've been glued to for the last few weeks, just seeing what's going on and also reading up on a lot of things that I was not aware of. So the great thing about this show, and I hope this shines through, is that just as much as I'm here to learn or to teach you, or hopefully I am learning a lot in return, like a whole lot. So, and these are the sources that help me make that possible. So if you get an opportunity, please go to Drilled News and check out their climate change locker. Please check out their climate COVID-19 tracker. It's really very, very informative, very helpful, and helped to sculpt this show. You can follow me on Instagram at Crossroads Podcast. You can follow me on Facebook and Twitter, Crossroads Pod C1. And thank you all so much for joining me today, and I will see you at the Crossroads.